I'm Leif, and in this cheer presentation, I'm going to present my review and critical reflection on cognitive biases in search. Now, over the last few years, there's been a lot of emphasis placed on considering how cognitive biases influence people's information-seeking retrieval behaviours and their performance, and specifically how they impact upon people's information processing, knowledge acquisition, and decision-making. Of particular concern is whether the influence of cognitive biases is exacerbated due to the instantaneous access to unprecedented volumes of information that is exploited and manipulated by search engines and content creators either inadvertently, deliberately, or even maliciously. Of further concern is whether cognitive biases may also interact with content biases, search engine biases, and algorithm biases more generally, and even if they lead to such system-sided biases, creating a vicious cycle where bias begets bias. Taken together, these biases, system-sided, user-sided, and content-sided, may compound together, amplifying the effects both positively and negatively. And so with an increasing amount of the population turning to search and retrieval systems to access, find, and consume information in order to make important life decisions, such as to decide on medical treatments, what party or policies to support, and where to invest, then investigating the influence and impact of cognitive biases within information seeking and retrieval is of economic and societal importance. Now, in this paper, I provide an overview of the different cognitive biases that have been empirically studied in search. And I categorize them according to their domains, so whether they're referring to medical and health, socio and politics, and the web, and by the parts of the search process, so whether they're focused on querying, assessing and examining, and judging during the search process. The paper summarizes about 40 studies and then collates and reports over 30 findings. Now, of course, we don't have time to go over each one of these in detail, so I'll just provide an overview of the work and highlight some of the open questions and challenges. Now, a cognitive bias is a systematic pattern in thinking which often leads to errors in decisions, in the sense that the decisions deviate from rational decision-making. Now, it is hypothesized that these cognitive biases manifest because of the tension between two conceptual systems in our mind. System 1, which is fast, automatic, intuitive, but error-prone, and System 2, which is slow, analytical, effortful, but more reliable. And while it's typically assumed that cognitive biases have a negative impact, leading to poorer decisions, this is not necessarily always the case all of the time. Instead, cognitive biases may simplify decision-making by reducing the amount of information and uncertainty that has to be processed, and thus act as a mechanism that enables fast and frugal decisions that make people smart. For example, people can develop information processing shortcuts that lead to more effective actions in a given context, or enable faster decisions when timeliness is more valuable than accuracy. So rather than being universally detrimental to decision-making, it has been shown that these fast and frugal heuristics that people employ result in good decisions most of the time. Now, over the years, inspired by Tversky and Kahneman's seminal work, researchers have discovered a large number of different cognitive biases, which have been categorized into 4 different groups. And they result because we experience maybe too much information, and therefore biases creep in so that we only notice changes or strangeness or repetition. When we don't have enough meaning, we tend to fill in gaps by creating patterns, making generalities, giving things the benefit of the doubt, or looking for simpler problems. And when we don't have enough time, well, we assume that we're right and we can do this, or we just choose the next nearest thing. Keep our options open by not making a decision, and always selecting the easier, not the better, right? And when we don't have enough memory, Then we tend to save space by editing memories, right? Generalizing, keeping one example in mind and using that, anchoring, and then using external memory sources. Now, in the information seeking and retrieval literature, there have been 14 cognitive biases that have received the most attention and have been subject to empirical investigations. In terms of too much information, we see there's been availability bias, framing effects, anchoring, and confirmation bias. So for instance, with confirmation bias, you see examples of this where people will actively look and select items that confirm or reinforce their prior beliefs. Whereas in terms of not enough meaning, we see largely with respect to how people assess results, the bandwagon effect or the reinforcement effects and exposure effects coming into play, where seeing the same opinion over and over again means that people start to sway to that opinion. Then in terms of not enough time, we see ambiguity, less is more effects, decoy effects, and the Dunning-Kruger effects. So for example, the ambiguity effect has been linked to domain bias, where people prefer domains they know or have seen before rather than unknown domains. And with respect to not enough memory, we see priming effects, order effects, and the peak and rule. And so there's been a lot of interest in how people will click on different search results. In particular, they tend to click on the first results. Thus these order effects creep in, and what's also known as trust bias. Now, of course, there's lots of other biases, and there's been a number of qualitative studies that have examined different possible biases that could come into play while people are searching, but they haven't been fully explored empirically yet. In terms of what has been explored, this table shows how we have broken down the number of papers into the different domains: health, socio-political, web, and then which of the four categories the biases result in. In the paper, we obviously break it down even further, but here is just a summary to show you the relationships between the domain and also the part of the search process that's relevant. So what's of notice here is that actually, in terms of how people assess and judge documents, there's been a lot of interest, a lot of works exploring this across all four different categories. In terms of health and socio-politics, the main focus has been on the first two categories, where in particular people have been focusing on anchoring biases, so whether they anchor to a first result or have a prior belief, whether they stay with that belief, and confirmation bias, whether they're seeking out information that reinforces or that belief. Or in terms of not enough meaning, whether they're subject to exposure and reinforcement effects, such that if they're presented with the same item or a similar point of view over and over again, do they accept that? And then in terms of web, most of the interest has been more in terms of the not enough memory category and perhaps the not enough time, where the ambiguity effects, so this trust bias, priming, and order effects have been studied predominantly. But you can also see that there's a lot of other areas across the different domains and search processes and biases that have not been studied in very much detail at all. One thing that was quite apparent when doing the study was that cognitive biases can have both positive and negative effects, but most of the literature has focused on their negative effects and their negative impacts. And I find this quite surprising, because if we're subject to so many biases at every single point in the search process, then why or how can we even make any decent decisions as a result of our searches? And so it would be nice to see more research dedicated and focused towards the positive impacts of cognitive biases and the heuristics that we take that expedite our search processes. Now, in terms of the findings and discussions, the paper presents 39 findings and 9 discussion points. Now, of course, we don't have time to go through them all, so I just want to highlight some of the open questions and future challenges. So, one of the interesting questions is, do cognitive biases compound with each other or do they conflict? Now, it appears that certain biases are kind of actually hard to distinguish because they often are observed together and potentially lead to compounding effects. For example, availability bias and exposure effects tend to be linked because the availability created by presenting documents with a certain point of view in the result list, coupled with a searcher engaging with a number of those items, can lead to a shift or sway in the searcher's opinions and beliefs. Now, what's also been observed is that there can be a tension between the different cognitive biases. So, for example, participants who made an initial decision on, say, who to vote for, and thus an anchor, were also swayed by exposure and primacy effects. However, when other searchers were provided an initial judgment on an item, they tended to stick with that anchor, despite other manipulations. And as such, there is a number of open questions that arise when considering cognitive biases in information retrieval settings. Which of these biases compound together and lead to better or worse outcomes? And which biases compete against each other? Do they wash themselves out? Or do certain cognitive biases dominate over others? Now, research suggests that some biases appear to be more deeply ingrained than others. However, while there's very much an open question about how much influence search engine manipulation can actually affect searchers' opinions, beliefs, and decisions, there is a worrying concern that it appears that leading searchers to an incorrect or poor conclusions by manipulating the cognitive biases is actually easier than mitigating cognitive biases to help lead searchers to correct or better conclusions. Another important question to consider is whether searchers or annotators are actually more susceptible if the decision doesn't affect them or they're not intrinsically motivated. So it may appear that the effects of these experiments, they're done in controlled and artificially controlled experiments, right? We might see these cognitive bias manifest because the participants are not really intrinsically motivated to find out whether, for example, cinnamon helps diabetes or not. However, if a person had been recently diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, then they have a clear motivation to learn about their condition. So will they really satisfy us and take, the first answer by their favorite search engine? More likely, they will undertake many searches, issue a number of queries, look at lots of different articles, discuss these articles with their friends, family, medical providers, and so on. So, of course, they may avoid certain results when searching, or select results that confirm their prior beliefs. But it is largely unknown what the actual influence would be on the searcher's health when the searcher's health is at stake. Other possibilities may be that some participants in the experiments may be looking to do the experiment as quickly as possible, so they can claim the payment and leave, right? And in this case, the motivations are not necessarily aligned with the experimental context, and this could lead to observing more cognitive biases or more pronounced effects from such cognitive biases. But perhaps reassuringly, the more effort that participants put into their search tasks, the more accurate their answers were, suggesting that if they do try harder, they are more likely to reach a better outcome or correct answer. Nonetheless, these points emphasize that care needs to be taken when designing and conducting such experiments, so that they aren't subject to, say, method bias or the observer expectancy effects. Now, on that note, it's worth taking a step back and asking a meta question, and to consider whether we as researchers are falling afoul to observer expectancy effect. Now, this is where experimenters can suffer a form of confirmation bias, incorrectly interpreting results to see patterns and trends that conform to their hypotheses, rather than considering alternative hypotheses. Now, I'm not saying that these cognitive biases don't manifest in practice or have an impact, but I think that we need to be open to the fact that we may be looking just a little bit too hard to find them, and we're not considering the alternatives. Now, in sum, cognitive biases can play a major role in shaping and influencing information seeking and retrieval behaviours and outcomes. However, we have only really scratched the surface in understanding the complexities of cognitive biases in search, and there are many challenges and open questions that need to be addressed and answered going forward. I hope that this work serves as an inspiration for investigating the many complexities of this phenomenon, exploring, for example, the impact of compounding and conflicting cognitive biases, the negative and positive effects of cognitive biases and the simple heuristics that make us smart, and how cognitive biases can be mitigated and manipulated to improve search behaviours and search outcomes. Thank you for listening, and for more details you can download the paper in the link below, and remember to like, comment and subscribe this video as it helps the algorithmic biases direct people towards cognitively biased content.